everybody. Welcome to the first of our only two videos for chapter 4. So this isn't quite as an extensive chapter as some of the other ones we've had. This is our first body system. So we've covered general anatomical language and homeostasis in chapter 1. We covered a little bit of chemistry topics in chapter 2. And then chapter 3 was our cells and tissues. And that was the material over the first exam. So now we are ready to start fresh on our next two chapters. So chapters 4 and 5 are what will be on exams 2. So lab exam 2 and lecture exam 2. So this first body system is your integumentary system, which is your skin and accessory structures. This first mini lesson, we're going to cover skin and body membrane. So they're kind of presented at the same kind of one right after the other. And then the second video is going to focus on the accessory structures of the skin, like hair, glands, nails. And I'm going to tag on a little bit of discussion on burns and cancer at the end of that second video. So before we get into starting with body membranes, I wanted to talk about the functions of the skin. So when we talk about our integumentary system, and this is down a little bit in the notes. So I'm just going to go into the notes, skipping past body systems, just so I can talk about the functions first. So protection, that's obviously, oops, not production. How about protection? This is the most obvious function. So clearly our skin is protecting, it's the outermost layer of our body. So it's going to be protecting us from bacteria, chemicals, the environment like wind and dryness. So we have our skin is serving as a protection function. The next one listed is thermoregulation. Thermoregulation. This is just a big word to say, maintaining your body temperature. So think about what your skin does when you get too hot or too cold. And so this is kind of reinforcing our homeostasis idea. So it's summer. So when we get hot, what happens on our skin? A couple things. So the most obvious is we sweat, right? So as we get hot, a signal being picked up by receptors goes to our control center, which is our hypothalamus in our brain, to say too hot, too hot. So then it's going to send a signal out to the effectors, which are all of our sweat glands, for our sweat to be secreted. And so then we get to this liquidy, watery sweat on our surface, and then that is evaporated out into the environment. And with the water being evaporated, heat out of your body will also be evaporated. So that's how we cool down. And at the same time, I know for me, when I get hot, my face gets really red, but your body tissues get red. Well, think about what's going on for your color to appear a little bit more reddish. And it's mainly because your blood vessels at the surface of your body are all vasodilating. They're getting bigger. So more of that warm blood goes to the surface where it's getting cooled off by the sweat. So your skin plays a huge role in your body's maintaining its temperature. Now think about the flip side. When it's winter in 6 months and we're cold and we're shivering and we're skin doesn't do the shivering, that's our skeletal muscles, but just the opposite of that blood supply. We don't usually appear flushed and kind of bright red when we are cold. If those vessels are going to vasoconstrict, and so we usually appear more pale and grayish and bluish if you really are super cold. So that's trying to not let our warm blood go out to the surface where it can lose a lot of that heat and keep it nice and centered on the core, which holds on to a lot more of our heat. And we also get goosebumps, which are regulated by some of our accessory structures. So thermoregulation is a huge function of our skin because it's such a big part of our bodies. It covers the entire surface, and there's a lot of it. There's a lot of surface area covering our skin, so it has that exposure to the environment with that evaporative cooling with sweating that allows us to cool us down, cools us down really quickly. Okay. The third function, kind of part of that sweat thing that we just got done talking about, is excretion. Your skin is an excretory organ. It's not just defecation and urination. So sweat contains water, but it also contains electrolytes and some wastes and some other salts. And so we can use our skin as a way to get rid of some excess things that we don't really need. And then lastly, synthesis of vitamin D. So vitamin D is a very important substance that our skin actually makes in the presence of ultraviolet light. So we don't want to have too much light because we don't want to get a sunburn, which could increase our cancer risk. But we don't want to have no light at all because then our bones could get weak, because vitamin D, along with calcium, helps to support strong bones. So we'll talk more about that in the skeletal system. So for functions of your integumentary system, we have protection, thermoregulation, excretion, and synthesis of vitamin D. All right, so let's get jumping into body membranes, and then we'll focus on the actual structures of the skin. All right, so when we talk about body membranes, there's 4 various types of membranes. We have cutaneous membranes, which is basically our skin, so we're going to spend a lot of time more about that. We have what are called mucose membranes. We have serous membranes, and then the last type are called synovial membranes, which are going to be on the next slide. So the cutaneous membrane, well, let me back up. So body membranes are always going to be made of 2 parts. Okay, there's 2 components. There's always going to be an epithelial component, and there's always going to be a connective tissue component. Okay, so all 4 of these examples have both epithelial parts and connective tissue parts. So we're going to be learning all about the cutaneous membrane in this chapter 4 discussion, because the epithelial part is your epidermis, which is the top layer of your skin. It's dry, right? It's superficial, it's on the outside of your body. The connective tissue part of your cutaneous membrane is what we call the dermis. So we're going to talk a lot more about that in the rest of this chapter. For mucose membranes are the membranes that line your cavities of your digestive tract, your respiratory tract, your urinary tract, your reproductive tracts, all of these tracts that have openings to the outside. Okay? So your mucosa of your up your nose, in your mouth, your esophagus, your trachea, your stomach, your small intestines, your urinary bladder, your urethra, those are all lined by what we call mucosa. And their epithelial layer varies depending on what it is. So if you remember some of our histology stuff from chapter 3, we have lining our trachea pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. That would be the epithelial component of mucosa. Whereas lining our stomach, we have simple columnar. So that would be the epithelial component. Sitting on top of a basement membrane, and that's going to be the connective tissue component. Transitional epithelium found in the urinary bladder and ureters, that is going to be the epithelial component sitting on a basement membrane, which will be the connective tissue component. Okay. The last one on this slide, the next one is serous membranes. Serous membranes are lining cavities. They're not connecting to the outside world. So mucose covers all your tubes connected to the outside world. Serous lines your sealed body cavities. So think back to chapter 1, we learned about our thoracic body cavity and our abdominal pelvic. And within the thoracic, we had the pleural cavities and the pericardial cavity, and then the abdominal cavity. So these are the spaces that are going to be lined by serous membranes. And there's 2 parts to a serous membrane. So we have what's called the parietal. Okay, so the parietal part. We have 3 parietals shown here. Parietal means on the wall of. So you have this body cavity. So I'm just going to do a very generalized body cavity, right? So here's the body cavity. The parietal membrane is going to be found on the wall of that cavity. Okay. And then let's say we have an organ. I'll just make a triangular organ because we don't really have a triangular organ. But then for just illustrative purposes, the other component to these serous membranes are what we call the visceral component. So we have visceral peritoneum, visceral pericardium, and visceral pleura. The visceral is a membrane that's found on the surface of the organ. Okay, so if we have a triangular shaped organ within this body cavity, parietal is going to be on the wall of the cavity. Visceral is going to be on the surface of the organ, right? So what we're showing here, they just did it all in the same color, which I like to color code. But if I were to do the parietal peritoneum, kind of track this pink line but overlay it with green, the parietal peritoneum would just be this, kind of those lines right there. It's covering the wall of your abdominal pelvic cavity. And then if I'm going to do the visceral, it's going to be covering and surrounding all of the surfaces of the organs, the small intestine, this stomach, or the stomach right here, the liver. So there's the other side of the liver, there's the other side of the stomach. We have a greater omentum coming down, we have our large intestine, and we have the outside edge of the rest of the small intestine. Okay, so visceral is on the surface, parietal is on the wall of the cavity. That's the only difference. And you can see the same thing with your visceral pleura and your parietal pleura, visceral pericardium and parietal pericardium. All right, so those are our three: cutaneous membrane, mucous membrane, and serous membrane. The last membrane is what's called synovial. So synovial are found membranes in your synovial joints, which we'll be seeing in our skeletal system, actually in chapter 5. So the synovial membrane is this green identified layer here. It's found lining these joint capsules. So we're not going to get into the structure of the joint capsule. That's for another day. So just know that synovial joints are lined. I said synovial joints. I meant synovial membranes. Let me fix that. Synovial membrane are found in synovial joints. So that's for our purposes right now. Just know synovial membranes are found lining synovial joints, and we're good. All right, so now we're moving on to the actual skin. So part of our integumentary system, the part of that cutaneous membrane, we have the epithelial component, which is called the epidermis. And then we have the connective tissue component, which is called the dermis. So the epidermis, epi means above, the dermis. So it's the epithelial tissue that sits on top of the connective tissue. It kind of makes sense. So our epidermis is made up of stratified squamous epithelium. Right, so if we remember, I'll try to get a highlighter. I'll do blue. So if you remember our basement membrane, kind of over here in the picture on the right, and our many, many layers of flattened cells, that lets us know we were talking about stratified squamous epithelium. So in the drawing picture over here on the left, there's our basement membrane, many, many layers of flattened cells, and they're flat on the top, right? All these cells on the top. So that lets us know that it is the squamous shape. So those are both illustrations of stratified squamous epithelium. So now we're just going to take that knowledge that we learned back in chapter 3, and we're just going to add to that. Now, all of these layers, layers of squamous cells, they are subdivided into other layers. Excuse me, there's 5 layers of epidermis. Well, there's 4 plus 1. So these pictures show us all 5, but know that these pictures are specifically of what we call thick skin. Thick skin is only found on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet. Okay, palms. I am bare feet, but I'm not going to pick my foot up to reach it to the camera. So palms and soles. Everywhere else, all the rest of your body is thin skin, and they only have 4 layers. And I'll identify which one is missing in thin skin. But we're going to start from the bottom. Okay, so the first stratum is called stratum basal. It means base layer, the bottommost layer. So I'll highlight that with my blue marker here. So it is the very bottom layer of cells that's attached to that basement membrane. They're stem cells. They're actively going through mitosis, replacing cells that are lost at the surface. Okay, so those are stratum basal. The next layer is called stratum spinosum. Okay, we can see that in the drawing, and we can see that in the micrograph. So stratum spinosum cells are quite a bit thicker. So I'll highlight that, and I'll box that in. So these are the stratum spinosum cells. Okay. The next layer on top of that are called stratum granulosum. Stratum granulosum, I'll highlight it in both picture and micrograph. Stratum granulosum, at this point, the cells are getting really far away from any blood supply. The epidermis does not have any blood vessels in it. You only get blood vessels down here in the dermis. My pen's not letting me write. I want to write blood vessels. So the further away that cells get from any blood supply, it's harder and harder for the nutrients to diffuse to the cell and for the waste products to diffuse away from the cell to get exchanged. So as we go further and further away from that dermis, the cells start to die and they start to dry out, but that's okay. Let me see. Nope, I can pick another color. There we go. Ooh, and I picked red too. So the blood supply is down here in the dermis. Your epidermis doesn't have any, and so as we move further away, they start to die. So in our stratum granulosum, those cells are really starting to kind of fade. They're drying out. Before they die, they fill themselves up with hard proteins and these proteins that get colored in stain when they stain. So you can kind of see that right here in the micrograph. I'm going to highlight. See how there's kind of dark greeny cells? That's going to be your stratum granulosum. So they're pretty easy to see in a micrograph because they're darkly stained. Okay, so these first three layers are found in all skin, thick and thin skin. It is the next one that I'll highlight with a different color. So the stratum lucidum. So the stratum lucidum is what's called a clear layer, like lucid means clear thinking. So stratum lucidum is a clear layer only found on your thick skin. As these cells of the stratum granulosum get pushed further and further away, they lose all of those dark staining granules, and it appears to be a thin, clear layer. So we can see that a lot better on the drawing. They made it really obvious. It's not always as obvious in a micrograph. So like over here, you can't really, they kind of put a tiny little line, and if you look really close, you can see a thin white boundary between that green and that orange layer. That's going to be your stratum lucidum. Again, only found in thick skin. The last layer found in both is called our stratum corneum. The stratum corneum is many, many layers, all of these, and by this time dead. They're totally dead. They're dried out, but they're hooked together by these strong proteins called keratin and those desmosomes, those strong intracellular connections. And so this is what we see on our surface. They're dry, they're dead, and there's a whole bunch of them. They're very tightly connected together, and that works great for the function of being protection. We don't want living cells way up close to the surface because they could get infected, they could get damaged, they wouldn't be able to be repaired very well. So this whole structure and function of stratified squamous epithelium works wonders for being the part of the epidermis. Okay? So that's our epidermis. Another thing associated with the epidermis is our skin color. There we go. Now down in the basement are the stratum basale. So this is our stratum basale. If I'm going to label these, this is going to be our spinosum. This will be our granulosum, and this will be our corneum. Granulosum over here. So by looking at these layers, can we determine whether this is thin skin or thick skin? Well, since there's no lucidum, it's thin skin, and the corneum's a little bit thinner. But right down here, hanging out in the basement, in the basal stratum basale, we have these orangey octopus-looking cells. I'll try to highlight it in this orange. So these are called melanocytes. So their job is to produce the pigment melanin. Melanin is a brownish colored pigment, and they send all these little extensions out, and then they release the melanin into the cells of the stratum spinosum, and they kind of color the cells. And so in the micrograph, you can see all of these dark colored cells. Those are your melanocytes. And then you can see some of the melanin kind of hovering over the nucleus of a cell. So this is my cell, and here's the nucleus. I don't have brown, so I'll just use dark blue. There's going to be little collections of that melanin sitting right over the nucleus, like a little sun umbrella, and that's exactly what it does. Melanin protects your nucleus from ultraviolet light. It's trying to prevent mutations to your DNA. And what happens when you have too much sun exposure? Well, the melanin can't keep up. Your DNA might get mutated, and you can end up with skin cancer, which is one of the topics we'll talk about at the end of the next video. So melanocytes are these very large cells producing the melanin, kind of distributes the melanin throughout the stratum spinosum and allows that melanin pigment to sit over the nucleus to protect it from ultraviolet light. So that's the relationship between your skin color and prevention of skin cancer. And that's why, as we are in the summer, if you're exposing your skin to more ultraviolet light like sunshine, you get a suntan because your body's like, hey, there's more sun being exposed. I gotta, crank up my production of melanin, and so your skin appears darker because it's responding to that sunlight, and you get that tan. And that's why in the winter, when you don't expose yourself to sun as much, your tan fades because your body's like, oh, not as much sun, we don't need as much protection. We can cut back on that production rate, and so your skin takes on a little bit lighter tone. Your production of melanin, the overall color of your skin, is genetically determined. So people with very pale skin, people with medium toned skin or darker skin, that's all based on their genetics. Everybody has about the same number of melanocytes in their body. It's just how much melanin do they produce and how long does that melanin stay in their skin layers will kind of give you a determination of your overall skin tone. But everybody can get sunburned, everybody can get a tan, everybody changes their melanin production based on their exposure to sunlight. It's just more obvious in different skin tones. All right. Our last part of this mini lecture is the dermis. So the dermis is the connective tissue component of our cutaneous membrane. So I'll highlight it here. Here's our basement membrane. So everything above this little green squiggly line is our epidermis, right? So this is all epidermis. And then everything below it is dermis, okay? And there are two layers. There's two layers of the epidermis. I'm going to outline them right here in this bigger picture. And you can kind of see the difference in texture. So this uppermost layer here, I'll get kind of a darker color. This is called the papillary layer. Because all these little bumps that I just traced, those are called dermal papilla. We can see that over here in this other micrograph, all of these bumps. And then down here, this is called the reticular layer. So the papillary layer is the closest layer of the dermis to the epidermis, and it's papillary because of all of the bumps. And reticular layer is deeper. It's made up of a dense connective tissue, lots of collagen fibers because it's nice and strong and tough and can twist and move in different directions. They're both very vascular, so you have a lot of blood supply in the papillary layer and you have a lot of blood supply in the reticular layer, and a lot of our accessory structures are going to be anchored in the reticular layer. So we're going to see that in the next video when we take a look at sweat glands and oil glands and hair follicles are all anchored in the reticular layer. So this picture on the right, this is actually thin skin. And if we wanted to do a little review of our epidermis, we can try to do that. So I will outline the first layer. So remember what that is called? Stratum basale. And then the next layer, stratum spinosum. And the next layer, kind of the darkly staining layer, stratum granulosum. And then the next layer, the upper dry, flaky stratum corneum. All right, so now we have all the layers of skin identified in this thin skin sample. We have our 4 layers of the epidermis and our 2 layers of the dermis. So let's do the same thing over here. Maybe the green will be a good. So I'm going to separate my epidermis from my dermis, so my squiggly boundary. Okay, so those are all the bumps. Those are the dermal papilla. And then I will separate our upper layer of the dermis, which is called the papillary layer. Now let's see if we can find our thick skin. Epithelial layers. This is going to be a little bit harder because it's kind of smaller. So our stratum basale is going to be right along this line, and I didn't do a very perfect boundary. And then we're going to have stratum spinosum, kind of that dark pink layer. And then sitting right on top of that, oh, this is not going to, it's not looking good. Right on top of that is going to be, maybe I'll just draw an arrow. This is going to be the granulosum. And then you can kind of barely see a really pale line, and that's going to be our stratum lucidum. You can kind of see it right under the word epidermis there. Oops, that was a little bit too long of a line. Let's see. Right. There's our stratum lucidum. And then all of this big, thick layer here. This is going to be our stratum corneum. These are good pictures for review. All right, and so that wraps up our, we did body membranes, functions of the skin, epidermis and dermis. All right, so I'll see you next time for the accessory structures of the skin. Bye.